Welcome to the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. Today's very special guest is Mark Blundell, Le Mans winner, former Formula One and IndyCar driver, and now CEO of Motorsport Management Group, MBP. We talk about processing power as the most underrated driving skill, what 253 miles an hour actually feels like, and why the best coaches are more like bodyguards than cheerleaders. Along the way, we get into self-belief, humility, and a few brilliant mistakes, and why don't crash might be the most accurate coaching advice ever given. It's quick, honest, and full of stories that coaches in any sport will recognise. Here's Mark Blundell. Mark, let's get started with some quick fire questions. First thing that comes to mind, what was your favourite pre-race snack?
Pasta.
What do you prefer, successful attack or successful defence?
Successful attack all day long. I'm not a defending kind of guy.
Okay, just going for it. Wet race or dry race?
Wet race. A huge amount of success in wet races, so never shy of a wet race.
Favourite corner ever?
Corner called the Corkscrew in Laguna Seca circuit in California, like no other corner in any other racetrack in the world.
What's special about it?
It is a blind turn-in off the back of about 150 miles an hour approach with a very steep descent, and you line yourself up with an old tree as your reference point.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's quite unique.
Okay, awesome. And final one for now, what's the most underrated driving skill?
I would actually say it's processing power. It's that little Intel chip that sits in the brain, because that's probably for me one of the major differences in racing drivers compared to some other sports. They are quite good at multitasking and processing lots of information at once, and I think it's probably underrated and not completely understood.
And I suppose processing power with the consequence of getting it wrong and the damage you could do to yourself and the vehicle that you're in.
Yeah, well, I think you'll find drivers are probably not that good at actually thinking about the consequences. They're more about actually judging and aiming on what the outcome will be in a positive fashion. So
fair enough.
Any negativity gets removed and put in a little compartment.
Okay, nice. High tolerance to risk then. Mark, it's a real privilege to have you onto the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. As our listeners know, the conversations we've had so far have focused solely on people who are first and foremost coaches rather than athletes who have come through and then adopted coaching further on. So I'm so excited for this conversation and to get your perspective on coaching and your experiences, both as a driver and as somebody who's supporting drivers. To get us going and into the conversation, would you mind just telling us a little bit about your journey, maybe the highs and lows you've had on as a driver, but also when you've started supporting drivers coming through the pathway too?
So yes, listen, I'm the kid done good. So I'm a youngster who's started life in a council estate, went through education and didn't actually achieve anything, and to the point of not even sitting an exam. Was quite fortunate that I was surrounded by some motorsport disciplines, firstly and foremost being motocross. So that's where I started out on understanding the tolerance for speed on two wheels, and was lucky enough to get some funding in place and support to go onto four wheels and get my stabilizer, so to speak. So I started my motor racing career in 1984 at entry level in a platform called Formula Ford 1600, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. So 84 started, and by 1989 was testing a Formula One car for the Williams Grand Prix team. So even back then, quite quick transitions. And went on to do 61 Grand Prix, few podiums, won Le Mans 24-hour, won some IndyCar races, and done several races across several disciplines over that period of time. And yeah, I'm now in what I call a real job, sitting behind a desk, and fortunate that I'm now in a position where I've been able to assist and hopefully contribute a little bit towards some of the racing drivers that we manage and look after. And that's been some 20 odd years that I've been doing that now. So, and actually still got two of my guys with me after 20 years. So that's probably one of the biggest inwardly thankful things of having that level of longevity and loyalty from the client side with me.
When you've worked with people for so long, what's at the center of that connection that means that you can sustain the relationship?
I think there's some key words. I think they are integrity. I think there needs to be transparency, honesty. And I think that's a case of, when the good times are good, everyone celebrates. When the bad times are bad, you have to be big enough and strong enough to actually say to the other side, like, look, we need to pull our socks up. It's not doing what we need it to do. And that's very much in the basis of, from our side, it's a triangulation. It's like the driver is our asset. It's an asset for us in terms of managing their career, but also an asset to that team or manufacturer that we're linked with. I think more than anything else, it's also having that trust, and trust between, a manager, a coach, an advisor, a mentor, whatever you want to phrase it, is important when you're in the world what you're in, and whatever sport that may be. It's something that, has to go deep, and it has to have a good solid foundation, because it's going to get tried and tested over the course of years.
Yeah, of course. And I think from lots of conversations with coaches over the years, that sense of authenticity, the things you just said, integrity, transparency, trust, come out so strongly. Having that connection with the person that you're coaching, so they know that the decisions you're making and the advice and the support you're giving has got their best interests at heart, goes such a long way. I was having a conversation with a coach developer recently, and we were talking about building trust. And I said, well, from my experiences, building trust takes time. And he said, that's a load of bollocks. Building trust takes skill. And maybe it's not as contrasting as skill or time. It's a combination of both. But how does that come about for you when you're working with people?
Yeah, I think trust, there's a balance. I think it does take time, because everyone is new to each other when they first engage. But I think that trust is built quicker than what you would expect if you are transparent and honest and open, and wholeheartedly have the best interests of that other person in your own heart, to make sure that you're making the right decisions for them, and you're not making the right decisions for us as a business and for me as an individual. Because, I always look at it that, they're the superstar. I've done my bit. And I look at coaching, advisor, mentor, manager, whatever you want to call it, that you're almost like a bodyguard. You're only there when needed. And in the meantime, in the interim period, you're behind the scenes, and it's like a little bit of a support system. But that takes time to build with the individual that you're looking after. And don't get me wrong, every single individual have all got their own nuances, and they've all got their own understanding of how they want to go about things. And I think that also is a trust element as well, is making sure that they feel comfortable that you are representing them in the right way, and you are supporting them with the right information at the right time. And not to say that always that information is golden. Times do change and things do adjust, and you have to evolve with that. And I think it's having an openness with that relationship that you can have those very direct conversations.
Has anything changed for you across your journey of supporting drivers? Is there stuff that you did at the beginning that maybe you wouldn't do now or do differently?
You learn as you go along, but I've always been very transparent and very open and very direct. And I say that because that's always how I wanted to have someone representing me. And actually, that was part of the problem for me. I never found someone who I actually fully engaged with to the point of understanding that they were representing me in the right way. So I think that's the biggest hurdle that you have to get over. Things have changed slightly over the years, because now also we have other influences coming in, and that little thing called a mobile phone that sits there with a whole host of information that comes across it. Sometimes is a benefit, and sometimes it can be a negative, because it's supporting frequency coming down the line all the time. It's firsthand and it's almost immediate, and that doesn't always go hand in hand with what your strategy is or your game plan, in terms of like, look, we're trying to put this out there as the perception of where we're heading, and we don't want any interference. So you've just created something that's hit the social media world that's actually causing us some problems, or there's some other stuff that you're seeing on social media actually that's detracting from where we're trying to head for. So that's part of where we are today in today's society, in today's world, and it's no different in the world of sport.
Yeah, there's so much noise, and finding the stuff that's really important and really valuable is quite difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's part of your role when you're looking after people, is actually to understand that they understand how to cut out that frequency and cut out the noise, because it's exactly that. Don't use up energy on some of that stuff. That's BS. It's not going to impact your career. What's going to impact is your performance, in a car, out the car, and you have to remember that.
When you introduced yourself, I think you seriously downplayed that you started driving in 1984 on two wheels, and then by 89 you were testing a Formula One car. That's quite a trajectory to go on. And you, through your journey, have raced in lots of different disciplines of the sport. How have you been able to adapt and adjust into different cars, different environments, different levels of endurance?
I think from a perspective of having an open mind, that, just in our world, there are so many different forms of motorsport that sometimes you get yourself blocked off from thinking that you can go and get the job done. And I've always tried to have enough self-belief that, like, okay, give me the equipment, I'll go and get the job done. And it doesn't matter whether that's, racing in a 24-hour endurance race, or whether we're doing a 2-hour Grand Prix sprint, or doing World Rally, for example. It's like, okay, it's a car, it's got 4 wheels, it's got pedals and a steering wheel. So work it out. And I think, with that gives you the confidence to go and attack things and give them a go. There's nuances to that. There's always going to be some differences in the way that you handle some things, and some experience will also help in that area. Jumping from a Formula One car and then going across to IndyCar and onto an oval circuit, for example, there are certain things that you have to re-engage with and reteach yourself, just because that's dictated to that you need to drive in a certain way to go around the circles, which sounds kind of crazy, but it is really that truthful in that fact.
When I moved myself from coaching in maybe a traditional sporting system to motorsport, people said to me, well, why are you moving to motorsport? And I kind of highlighted that coaching was such an underplayed role within that world. And I felt that there was a huge opportunity to be able to support people who are doing brilliant work and gently raise the bar as time goes on. You mentioned a minute ago that you never necessarily found the right support or enough of the right support along your journey. What were the things that really did help you when you were, especially in those early years of kind of finding your feet and moving towards testing for Formula One? Was it certain people or certain experiences that had a real impact on you?
So I would say probably from my side, I learned a huge amount from my teammates, because 99% of the time they were always more experienced. And I think that's a great reference and a great gauge. In an F1 especially, they normally are your biggest opposition, and they are the only reference because they're normally the only other person in a car the same spec as yours. So I think always on that side of things, there was a lot to be gained and a lot to learn. I think coming through the sport, you make sure that you always, for me, I look at it like a toolbox, I'm gaining lots of different tools as I go along on the journey, and like it's understanding them and to pull out, the bottom drawer and take that tool out because I'm going to use it here. And a lot of that is beneficial in terms of the people that I met. I try to draw down from their experiences and their knowledge and gain. We didn't really have like a hands-on coach in my generation of the sport. Only towards the end of my one career that we started to get into a more scientific approach. And in motorsport as well, there's different ways of looking at coaching, because you can say, oh, I need a driver coach. And actually, what's that? Is that somebody that's going to teach me how to drive? So that's actually quite a difficult thing for me to actually say to someone like, oh, I'm going to improve your driving. There's some points that I think you can give people insight into, and you might be able to give them a little bit of understanding on references of the way that you apply the throttle, the way that you apply the brake pedal, the way that you turn in. But fundamentally, there's also the point of like, there's a different style of driving for people. So sometimes you have to adapt the car to suit that driving to get the best performance. For me, the biggest tuning device in a racing driver, and I still think the biggest tuning device of any sports person, is what sits on the shoulders. It's that thing called a brain. And when you tie that against the emotional system that we have as human beings, I think that's your biggest pro and your biggest con. And it's just trying to keep everything in tune to, link up with the physical abilities that person might have.
The ability to remain cool and calm and able to make good decisions whilst under a huge amount of pressure.
Yeah, and I think that's sport in general. I think the top sports people are the ones that actually can absorb pressure. They're able to suck it up and actually take it on board It's a bit like a big CEO of a multinational. You know, they've got a huge amount of pressure on their shoulders, but they're not in a flap. It's like, okay, let's just absorb it and let's make some decisions that we think are going to be the right outcome. And for me, sport is no different. You know, it's the ones that crumble when the pressure mounts outside them that probably is either them still learning or still lacking a bit of self-confidence, or at the same point, that just, you know, the DNA of that individual isn't quite going to crack it. So we just have to accept that you can only get so far.
Yeah, of course. To make a technical link across to what you're saying, you spent a few years of your career racing in IndyCar. Now, is IndyCar 500 miles? Is that about the duration?
So there's certain races that are 500 miles in duration on an oval circuit. So to give you an idea, I won a race called the Fontana 500, which is a 500-mile event. And top speed then was like 253 miles an hour and 227 miles an hour in a corner. And we were doing an average lap time of 2 miles in 30 seconds. So pretty damn quick. Yeah.
Wow.
Much quicker than Formula One.
Yeah.
And then when you put sort of another 25 other drivers and cars around you on a circuit of that size, it starts to do some weird and wonderful things. And you almost become like a pilot sitting in a small aircraft because you get these pockets of air and buffeting and turbulence. So yeah, it's an interesting few hours at the wheel.
Crikey. So if you were to unpick the way you make decisions, I guess it's not a conscious thing at all by the time you're at that point, but what does top class decision making look like when you're doing 253 miles an hour?
So I think for me, it's like, you know, always people ask me a question like that. What do you know? How do you process? I said, look, you subconsciously have already achieved what you want the outcome to be in your mind. You know, if I'm going into a corner or I'm lining up somebody to try and overtake, in my own mind, I've already achieved it. You know, I've gone through that and it's like, right, this is my process. This is what I'm going to do. The physical side of it may not have quite happened yet, but that's, you know, where my focus is. And it's for me like a snooker player. You know, good snooker players, 2 or 3 shots ahead. And they might be on the red here, but they're already thinking about the other red and the pink and the scoring of getting up to that break. And I think that's no different to drivers. That's the way that they go about it. And I think they do that, for me, is like the way that I did it, because it gave me capacity and it also didn't drain me of energy because I'd already processed it. And that might be different to other sports people, how they look at things, but that's my personal approach, how I used to handle it.
I was fortunate enough. This is my really rookie experiences compared to your world-class experiences. I was really fortunate to spend some time whilst I worked at Motorsport in a place called iZone Driver Development at Silverstone with a brilliant coach called John Pratt, who put me in a simulator a few times and effectively helped me crash less when I was driving around Donington in a Formula 2 car. And he kept encouraging me to look further, look beyond, look into the apex, look beyond. And I noticed as that became more natural, everything that I was thinking about and doing became more controlled. It was almost like I was able to think more clearly and slowly. But it took a lot of time to be able to get used to looking where almost instinctively I didn't want to look. How do you help people who are coming through that journey do things that maybe don't feel natural to begin with, but then you're almost learning some new behaviors to help you perform?
John's a great coach. I actually raced against John in 1984, so that will give you some understanding of those journeys. So he's a good guy. But listen, I think there's a little bit from my side of breaking it down. I think there's manufactured sports people and I think there's natural sports people. And I'm not saying that the outcome is any different. I'm just saying they have to get there in a different way. So sometimes it may be that they really have to be process driven, you know, on that repetitive cycle of trying to understand how they achieve the outcome. And then there's other times when you just get someone maybe jump into a simulator and they just like, bang, they got it. You know, it's no different than picking up a golf club and all of a sudden they've got a natural swing. Yeah, I might pick it up and I've got to keep doing the same swing 50 times to, you know, get an outcome. So I think there's that element of it, and we can't take that away. I think that's just a human nature DNA thing that's good, bad, or indifferent. But I do think there are certain ways that, you know, people can support and give insight. And you know, like that kind of reaction from John is no different to people driving every day as well. And I'm just saying this, you know, to people that I know, even when we're driving on the open roads. When I drive with a get out jail free card. You know, I'm driving all the time, processing information and understanding if something goes wrong, that I'm going here as an exit or here, because that's the least damage or, you know, damage limitation that I can do for myself and any others. You know, and learning a trade or learning something from a sports perspective is also the same thing. It's just like, go ahead of yourself and get yourself into a position where you're like subconsciously already in the corner, subconsciously achieved it, and give yourself capacity, because you're going to need that extra capacity when things get even harder. Because at the moment you're only out there on your own with like not much risk. When you're doing what you're doing and all of a sudden there's somebody by the side of you at 150 going into turn one, and you've got to make some more split decisions and you've got to process it. If you've already maxed out capacity, the outcome's going to be pretty bad.
I'm going to shift the conversation for a second over to from individuals to teams, because I'm sure most people who are looking into motorsport from the outside would see it very much as an individual sport, an individual endeavor. It's all about that driver almost being like the fighter pilot, and all the resource goes around them. But of course, you can't achieve anything in any walk of life, but especially in sport on your own. I remember having a debate actually with some of the younger drivers in our pathway at motorsport around is motorsport an individual sport or a team sport? And there were definitely some very different opinions on the matter. But in 1992, you won Le Mans. And I can imagine that kind of level of endurance racing requires extensive teamwork. And I wonder, when it comes to that experience or similar ones, what are the things that you've noticed about high-performing teams? And in that case, like, what did your team do brilliantly when you won the race?
I think the biggest thing for that was preparation, you know, and preparation in a way that actually our win in 1992 had already started back in December the previous year, because we were already doing endurance testing and understanding the weaknesses and the areas that needed to be strengthened, whether that was from a driver squad perspective, whether that was from a team perspective of mechanics, engineers, whether that's from a resilience, durability point, whether that was from, are we getting enough nutrition? Are we getting enough fluids going through the 24 hours? Because actually what we did, we tested for 36 hours, not 24. So, you know, this is like, if we're going to break it, this is how long it takes to break. And if we're going to break the team members, this is how long they can sustain that kind of level of intensity. So for me, preparation was the big area. And there's also a mindset change, especially when you go to endurance racing, because it's no good me going out number one in the car and going delivering a lap time, and I've used every single curb to get there, and I've broken the car in bits underneath, and we've only done 2 hours of a 24-hour race. And then I deliver it back to the next guy, you know, the next girl that gets in the car and behind the wheel, and like they get in it, it's like, oh Jesus, this is off pace, because, you know, half the aerodynamics have been broken underneath it and the car's like in bits. That doesn't work. So there needs to be discipline. There needs to be camaraderie. There needs to be a focus from everybody that we all have to contribute, and we contribute with the one aim. And it doesn't matter whether it's somebody putting on a left front wheel, or whether it's someone doing, 200 miles an hour on the Mulsanne straight, or whether it's someone who's delivering the breakfast and the fluids for that team member or driver at 3:30 in the morning. You know, it has to be done. It has to be done via process, because we know what the benefits are of supporting the system. I think there is, without a shadow of a doubt, in my mind, no question about it. It may be an individual sport for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon, but even at that point, it isn't. There's so many people involved in the process, and without them, you couldn't get the job done.
What I heard as well in your answer there was about clarity, and people having real clarity on what their role is and what's expected of them.
100%. And because, with clarity and what the role is comes accountability. And, at that point, whether it's me behind the wheel and I screw up and then I have to put my hands up and say I made a mistake, or whether, I come into the pit lane and somebody doesn't get the tyre on and there's 2 seconds that I've lost in a pit stop, someone's accountable for that. And especially when you get to the high end of sport, where it overlaps with the business world, because ultimately, like, the finance involved is big numbers, and the pressures start to rise at an even bigger boiling point, so to speak. So there's a lot of intensity, and without having that transparency of saying, look, I screwed up, and in reverse, with also being in a situation where the success comes and everybody supports each other with, we did it, I think that's a real weakness of organizations. If they can't look inwardly and face the consequences of whether they've screwed up or whether they've done well. There's ups and downs in life, and we know that. It's just whether you recognize it.
You mentioned a word a while ago, resilience. And I heard somebody define resilience. He defined resilience as the restoration of hope, which for me really resonates because it's forward looking and it's thinking about what can we go and achieve, what have we learned. And there's so many forces on a driver in world-class racing. And in any sport, there's people, I suppose, who are ready to take your seat or take your place if things don't go well over a sustained period of time. When things have gone wrong for you, whether that's a small mistake or something more critical, how have you been able to bounce back when things haven't gone to plan?
Self-belief, because nobody else is going to believe for you. You are the end byproduct of your career and journey. So the only person who's going to understand that they're giving it 110% is you, and that I think also the case of having resilience in terms of you are 100% focused on trying to recover, get back, or absorb what's going on at that time, and you still maintain a self-belief of knowing that you're going to get there. With that self-belief comes a lot of energy sapping and a lot of sacrifice. And I think that, 99% of the time is what ultimately gets to people. I look at people in our sport, an Alonso or an Hamilton. For me, they're remarkable because they've got, huge amount of resilience because they're still able to operate at a level at the top of the sport, and they're doing it a long way into their journey in life. And, for me, I think that's quite incredible. So, but they can only do that if they believe in themselves and believe in what they think they can contribute every day. Yeah, so that's where it becomes hard. That's where you get worn out quite quickly.
In every episode of the podcast, we're asking our guests to contribute something to our game plan. So it's a shared playbook of stories and ideas and lessons that coaches can draw on. And we're asking every guest to add something unique. So I know you're kind of keeping you on your toes by asking this, but what would you add to the game plan?
Listen, I think for me, I'm not sure whether there's any magic. I think it's just remembering to be humble, remembering also that everybody you meet on the way up, you're going to meet on the way down. And I think in sport as well, there's, that's been such a plus for me. I've tried to keep every single door open on the basis that I knew that there was going to be an end of the road. And that end of the road, me, is taking me into a different walk of life, but I'm still able to go through all of those doors and hopefully use that to benefit me in later life and my business. So whether you're a sports person, whether you're a coach, wherever you may be and whatever you're doing, just factor in that everything that goes up has to come down. And, like on that journey, just make sure that you remember that. And I think that will keep you humble. That will keep you with some humility, because especially in top line sport, and again, whether you're the key person that's got the headlights on and the focal point, or whether you're in the support act, sometimes when you get to the heady levels of international sport, people forget that there's a big wide world out there, and everyone's got their troubles, and they get a little bit isolated in a bubble. And I think sometimes there's some understanding that people need to make sure that they don't forget their roots. Keep humble, keep it real.
When you're working with drivers you support or others that you support, how does that show up in your conversations?
Because I'm the first one to tell them, and being frank, I don't want to work with prima donnas. That doesn't work for me. I need to work with people that I can invest in, and I want them to invest in us, because coaching, management, again, however you want to class it, is a two-way relationship. There is no one-way traffic with it. It can only work if both sides buy into it. I'm fortunate. I'm in a position where I can say to someone no, but that's not something that I want to say. It's actually sometimes it just comes about in a very organic way that I don't think we're going to really fit. The synergy's not there. When you get it right, it's a very rewarding relationship, and it's a very rewarding outcome. One word as well that just echoes with everything that goes on is respect. And if there's mutual respect on both sides, that's the start of a great foundation.
Absolutely. In my work as a coach developer, and when I've coached as well, it's become more and more apparent to me over the years, but the importance of framing, or I guess in some worlds, contracting the type of work that you do with a person. From a football perspective, I've tried to bring it to life by asking players, how do you want me to coach you? What's going to be best for you right now? And you get a variety of different responses and work with what you've got. And it's also, for me, created the boundaries of being able to call out a behaviour, because we've agreed that that's part of my role. When you do your work, is that something that you incorporate into the process? And if you do, is it helpful?
I think there's an understanding. There'll be an understanding from your side when you're working with somebody, what that individual is made up like, how they tick. And it's almost for you to understand how you monitor that ticking. How did that 60 seconds get made up in a day? And how do I then support that and make it, you're not going to make it quicker, but are you going to make it more productive? And that for me is like, understanding that individual to the point where, how can we make their life easier? And if I can make their life easier in whatever way that may be, that hopefully will have a benefit in the outcome of what they do best when that, 2 hours of Grand Prix might come along, or whatever the case may be, or that 90 minutes of football. And I think that's part and parcel of the role of people around sports people. They need to buy into the fact of, let's try and process and understand how we get our athlete, our sports person, our racing driver to function at the highest levels they can. And how do we understand how we support that? And let's not also forget that there's also a very emotional journey that's taking place alongside that sporting one. And if those emotions are not stable and they're not good, solid foundation attached to them, that can impact on what the sporting outcome is. So, it's very intensive at times. It's very consuming as well in understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Such relational work to do. And with that, it's not something that you can do in a transactional way. It's person to person. Mark, thank you for adding self-belief into the game plan. We're going to change the energy again. We'll go back to 5 more quick-fire questions before we move into the final part of our discussion. So here we go. Let me just pull them up. I asked you earlier about favourite corner. From your journey, what's your least favourite track section?
It would be my least favourite circuit. It would be like Hungaroring, just because it was actually, for me, it was like a go-kart track for a Formula One car. You shouldn't really have dislikes, but probably my least favourite track, and consequently my least favourite set of corners. So, just disregard that one.
Okay, fair enough. Pre-race superstitions?
A few. I would always get into a race car from the right side, just because it was like a routine. At the same point, I also was very vocal in asking people, even mechanics now, don't come up and tap me on the helmet when I'm about to just start a race. Like, I didn't like it. I didn't like something resonating through my head just before I'm about to start a Grand Prix. So I'd ask people to make sure they didn't do that. I think more than anything, routine. So not necessarily superstition, but like just having a routine that you felt comfortable with and that, gave you your baseline start process.
You said earlier about teammates being the real source of learning. So who's the most impressive competitor that you've raced against, or other driver that you've learnt the most from?
So I've learnt a huge amount from my teammate and namesake Martin Brundle, and we were in the team together on 2 occasions because of his wealth of experience. I learned a huge amount from working alongside Senna as reserve test driver at McLaren. Probably from him learnt more about understanding that the cockpit of the race car was an office, and then outside of the office you also had to work extremely hard to make sure that you got all the benefits from everybody around you. Delivering on track is one thing, but drivers need to be the motivator, the politician, their own CEO, their own CFO, and you have to really work hard at that. So that would probably be the most influential people that were close by as teammates or as colleagues that I raced against.
What is the car that you would love to have one more lap in?
An easy one, actually, and it's a car that I never raced. It was a car that I tested. So it would be a Williams FW14B, which was a hugely successful Grand Prix car and probably pound for pound was the best racing car I've ever driven.
And last but not least, what's the best coaching advice you've ever received?
Don't crash.
Fair enough.
Simple but true.
Okay, we're going to move into the final part of our podcast, which is where we ask our guests to share some game-changing advice, something practical and powerful. And I often say at this point that maybe this is something that other coaches could pick up and try out in their own environment. They might want to edit it and make it fit the context, or it might be just something they reflect on and come to at another time. So have you got any game-changing advice for our coaches?
That's a tough one. I think, more than anything, I think if you're on the other side of the coin, and if it's from a coaching perspective or a mentoring perspective, I think it's actually, we talked about self-belief, but it's actually also having belief in the individual that you are supporting. Because I think you have to be authentic with it. And I think if you don't have that engagement and that belief that you feel that they are the real deal, then you're doing yourself a disservice, and you're doing a disservice to the person that you are coaching or looking after. If I look at a driver and I don't see the glint in their eye and I don't think they can get the job done, my enthusiasm is not at the levels where it should be. And that means I'm not going to give the best support I can. So I think it's just being wholeheartedly honest with you and the other side of the coin to say, look, this is not a good match. And that actually takes quite a lot to achieve and get done. And it also, especially when you're in the world of business, sometimes it's very difficult to say no. But sometimes it's the right answer.
Sometimes not stepping in is a coaching intervention in itself, whether that's on a small scale, working directly with somebody, or if you're taking on new projects or not.
Yeah. And I think there's also a case that at times, being a person in that role, you also have to understand that at times in the career of the person you're around, they will have to make their own mistakes and learn by them. You can't always fill in the pothole to make sure they get a smooth ride. There's going to be some definite high and low points, and they sometimes are going to have to learn them the hard way.
Yeah, completely. I've mentioned this before on another conversation, but I worked with a boxing coach who said to me that in boxing they have this mantra around that mistakes lead to magic. And for my own coaching in football, with younger players, you're trying to create an environment constantly where you remove some of the barriers and some of the fear attached to making mistakes. So people will try things and push boundaries and understand where their limits are. What about you? Are there any mistakes or moments across your journey as a driver which has actually been fantastic for your own learning?
Listen, I think there's been a huge amount of mistakes that I've made on my journey, but there's also context that surrounds that, and maybe decisions that I made and responsibilities at the time. But I think the main factor is exactly what you just touched on. Like, when you make a mistake, you learn from it, and hopefully you build from it. I go to the basics of even when I was driving, and I say I was testing, I would pick a circuit and I'd pick one corner and say, right, there's enough runoff area, there's enough margin. I'm really going to experiment here to see how far I can push this thing and see when it lets go on me. And that's the basics of trying to understand whether, you're going to make errors and whether you learn from them. But then you go all the way through that whole journey and the decision-making process, whether that's interacting with people in the wrong way, whether that's putting yourself in a situation or position that actually you shouldn't have been in. They're all part and parcel of journey-making history. With that, not everything goes according to plan. So, ultimately, if you learn from them and you make yourself a better individual, and if you get the point where you can actually hand some of that experience down and then it gets taken on board, then great.
I'm going to paraphrase here. I've got a coaching friend who did some work with Eddie Jones, the former England rugby union coach. And he asked Eddie, where does risk live in your week? And he said Monday mornings, flippantly, but highlighted the fact that Monday mornings were the furthest part of the week away from the performance moment at the end of the week. But without engineering some risk into the way that you do your work, so you can make mistakes and find out things and then evolve what you do, you'll never move forwards as a team or as an individual. And it's always stuck with me about, where does risk live? If that's in the micro of a session or the macro of a season, risk feels critical to be able to get better.
I think that's true. And I think there's also an element of calculated risk. And I think that's something that sort of comes back to our side of things. When you're driving, you're in a car, there's a certain amount of calculated risk. And they're not all superheroes out there that don't think they can go out and never get hurt. There is self-preservation built into them, but they're also very good at calculating the level of risk that they're prepared to take on and what they're confident about taking on. That could also come back and bite them in the backside if they've done that in a test day and it's gone wrong, and then all of a sudden they're sitting there with an injury and they can't drive in a Grand Prix on Sunday afternoon. But again, that's part and parcel of assessing your own abilities and assessing who's around you and what's around you and what you might be in at the time.
Mark, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. There's 3 headlines that have come up for me throughout today. You highlighted earlier that motorsport might look like an individual sport for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon, but everything surrounding that is a team sport. Right back at the start of the conversation, you highlighted, I love the analogy actually, around a coach perhaps being a bit like a bodyguard. You're there to support the person. You're in the shadows a lot of the time, but you find your moments to step in and maybe support with that risk. And there's 5 key words that have come out really frequently for me that I think anybody listening to this can reflect on how this lands in their own environment. So self-belief, maybe that's you as a coach or for the athletes that you're coaching. Humility, discipline, respect, and honesty. Feel like the DNA that sits with the work that you've done and that you do. So it's been a really rich conversation, and thank you so much for everything that you shared.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure to be on board, and good luck with the rest of your episodes.
Thanks for listening to the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please follow the show and share it with a coach who might find it useful. I'd love to hear your feedback and any ideas for future guests. You can get in touch through the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and go well in your next coaching session.